You are listening to the Dr. J Talks podcast. Welcome to a special episode of the Dr. J Talks podcast. Today, we are discussing the historical significance of the federal holiday known as Juneteenth, commemorating the emancipation of enslaved African Americans, also known as America's Second Independence Day for free slaves, and what Juneteenth means for African Americans in our country now. Joining me is Dr. Mark Draper. Mark is the Director of Library Services and Associate Professor of Historical Theology at Lancaster Bible College and Capital Seminary. He received his PhD in Historical Theology from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, as well as a master's degree in Christian Thought from Biblical Seminary, a Master's of Library and Information Science from Drexel University, and a BA in History from Temple University. The man is well credentialed. Mark has served in higher education and liberties for over 20 years, in libraries for over 20 years. Mark has taught from the undergraduate level to the doctoral level. He writes and presents in the areas of church history, American religion, antebellum history, and theology. He lives in Lebanon, PA, with his wife, Dawn. Dr. Draper, welcome to the Dr. J Talks podcast.
So, it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, Mark, I have had several interactions with you on campus. You are a very intelligent man, a student of history, and an academic scholar, and I do not say that lightly. You are also a church historian and a big Philadelphia guy as well. So Philly, as we know, is home to some of the earliest Black churches and denominations in America. You even recently took your students on a field trip to visit some of the historical sites in Philadelphia. So before we dive into the Juneteenth talk, just discuss a little bit about how important was the anti-slavery movement that was in the city for free Blacks during that time.
Oh, well, Philadelphia was extremely significant because Philadelphia was founded by Quakers and Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn and was a sort of a free space for Quakers seeking religious toleration. One of the things that early they bring with them is an anti-slavery perspective. Not all Quakers. Quakers as a group will not end slavery amongst their church, their group, until around the time of the American Revolution. But as early as within a couple years of coming to Pennsylvania, there are Quakers who are opposed to slavery. And some of this has to do with Quaker theology. Quaker theology is interested in, they focus on what's known as the inner light, that all people have the inner light. So it has a very egalitarian nature to its theology. Also, they're pacifists. They're opposed to war, and everybody knew at this time the way you get slaves is through war or capturing or something like that. And so these were all things they were opposed to. And so you start to see some of this. That doesn't mean there weren't plenty of slaves that made a whole lot of money off of slavery, or Quakers who made a whole lot of money off of slavery, but there was an early movement. And so what happens is that Philadelphia early becomes a bit of a haven in some cases for free Blacks, especially when Pennsylvania will abolish slavery. And so you start to get a large free Black community in places like Philadelphia. The other thing that's helpful is its proximity to the South. A lot of people don't realize that the Mason-Dixon line, which is sort of Maryland, Pennsylvania there, was actually developed over land disputes between charters between Maryland and Pennsylvania. So there's a reason that we're so close to the South. But with that proximity, that allowed for people to operate the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia. It was a quick place to kind of get in. So even people like Frederick Douglass, when they escaped from Maryland, will spend some time in Philadelphia. So it does have that sort of sense about it between the Quakers, between the proximity to the South. it does start to create that, and there's actually some space for African Americans to become wealthy in some cases. Not, and you
Mhm.
actually start to have at times you'll actually have a black middle class in Philadelphia. So it's a unique space in that regard.
Sure. And definitely Maryland as well as uh, Pennsylvania is historical to Blacks and African Americans. So I can value what you're saying. And in fact, where I live is only about 20 minutes from the Maryland line. So I understand the historical
Yeah.
component of that. So let's transition a bit. Can you explain the historical significance of Juneteenth?
Yeah. Frederick Douglass gave a famous speech in 1852 called "What is the Fourth of July to the Slave," where he really calls out what feels like the hypocrisies to African Americans. There's all this celebration about liberty and freedom and equality, and meanwhile, the 4 million of his brothers and sisters are in chains. And he gives this speech where he calls out the nation, he calls out the church, and today, this is a very famous speech that we read, and it's not until the Civil War and 2 years into the Civil War where we actually start to see the Union Army fighting to liberate slaves, and it's really important for the listeners to understand that when Lincoln attacks slavery in 1863, he is attacking it as a war aim. um, for instance, if you have a society where all of your labor can be done by a caste, such as African Americans, you are free to send more of your white men to fight.
Mhm.
So, therefore, by attacking the labor source, you are attacking the nation's ability to have a war, to fight a war. You're attacking their production. You're also attacking their production of cotton, which financially enables the Confederacy to continue the war. They need the revenue from that resource. So for Lincoln, this is he can pass this off on the Union. He can sell this as a war aim, and so you start to have this attack on slavery for 2 years. That doesn't mean that for 2 years prior, that the 2 years before that, that African Americans weren't freeing themselves by escaping to Union lines and creating a bit of a crisis for the Union Army and trying to figure out what are we going to do with all of these people.
How difficult was that to actually escape the Confederate South for African American slaves during that time?
It was very difficult, very difficult. The advantage you would have had is if you were, say, somewhere in Northern Virginia and you were very close to Union lines, you had a chance, or in the middle of combat and there was just a sense of chaos taking place. You could run, you could possibly run off to Union lines. But no, it was very difficult. It was very
Sure.
dangerous. It was the probably the chaos in the culture and the society that would have eased it in any kind of way, if we even want to use that word. But very difficult thing to do. But it happened in droves. And in some cases, you would have the plantation people, as the Union armies invaded, would take off and leave the slaves. That would happen, and therefore it became a lot easier. Other times, though, it was very difficult to escape slavery because plantation owners would move their slaves away from Union lines. And the where Juneteenth is so important is one of the best places if you're a plantation owner to move your slaves to was Texas. Texas was the westernmost part of the Confederacy. If you needed to, you could quickly dip into Mexico. They had their own foreign border. It was also before the Civil War, before it was part of the Union, it was its own independent slave republic. There were people who thought that even if things go bad on the East Coast for the Confederacy, perhaps Texas could be the fallback position and we can restart the Confederacy in Texas. The idea of the Confederacy only being Texas was something that some people were willing to consider. So Juneteenth becomes so important because it's not until June 19th that all of the slaves now, and I use that word all very cautiously, but
Sure.
officially, all of the former Confederate states had been an order had been passed that slaves are now free. But that did not mean that all African Americans were free at this point.
And Dr. Draper, we're actually going to take a deep dive into that. It's a very significant point, and I've read your blog, and you've mentioned in detail about how not all slaves knew, and that's going to be one of my questions. But I want to ask you this. Now, many of the Union soldiers who fought against slavery were Black themselves. So, talk about the role that the Union Army had in actually delivering the message to slaves in the Confederate States and on plantations about the message of emancipation.
Yeah. Well, the point you make about the question you ask about African American soldiers, this is another advantage of the Emancipation Proclamation. As you free people, as you encourage escaping,
Mm,
you actually create a population of people who can serve in the army.
sure.
And so that becomes a big part of this. The other thing it does is it encourages slave revolts, because now the Union armies in the area. So the Union Army would, like I said, what I think is really important is at the early on. I think a lot of the way the emancipation is happening is slaves are just leaving. They're just running away they're running the
Right.
Union lines. But as the Union Army is moving south, they don't have a plan on what to do with free Africans. This is not in the algorithm to figure out what of the war. But as once the Emancipation Proclamation happens, the Union Army is now a liberating force, and they are announcing this. They are declaring this as they conquer entire states of the Confederacy and begin to set up military governments. They are able to impose this. This is a very important part of this: is that in war, oftentimes it's the general, the supreme general, who is really the government. The military is the government in many cases.
Sure.
They are the ones who impose the laws. They're the ones who police the state. They kind of do everything. They're judge and jury in some way. So the Union Army plays a really important role in that perspective, in the sense that this is a military thing. This is a military decision. This is not a peacetime decision. And it's not going to be decided by legislatures and judges. It's going to be decided by military procedure.
It
Uh,
sounds like it was very strategic, and the Union Army had definitely an agenda to accomplish. I want to also ask you this. So, unless the Union Army actually captured the land, the emancipation really had no effect among the slaves?
that's a very good point. Yes, I mean, what the Union Army finds out is, okay, we've announced it, but as they begin to move further and further into the Confederacy, even into maybe even into states that they have pretty much conquered, the government back in, say, a more off beaten path part of the Confederacy, they're still operating as if nothing's changed. So it almost takes conquering almost every square inch in some regard, right?
Sure.
For this to happen. So yes, I mean, this is the thing, that even after Juneteenth, there's still slavery happening. There are still people practicing slavery in backwater parts of the Confederacy, where nobody knows, or the plantation manager knows, but they're not going to tell their slaves, or everybody knows, including the slaves, but every time they attempt to walk off the plantation, they're threatened with murder or something like that. And there isn't any Union Army around to run to
Mm,
protect them, even in freedom. So it takes time to really weed out slavery.
sure. Yeah, we definitely know that on January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln used his wartime powers to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which generally declared all slaves free. And I can remember as a child growing up in New York City in the public school system, I never knew the second half of that. All I've heard was the slaves were free, and then everything was all good after that.
Yeah.
Uh, But is it true that the enslaved people in Galveston, Texas, did not learn about their emancipation until 2 years after 1865? And I think you've already hinted to that. But for my listeners, do you mind just clarifying a little how significant that point was?
So in the June 19th, so Galveston uh, is when Texas surrenders to the
Mhm.
Union Army. Uh, and this happens in a lot of the Confederate states. It's chaos. The government is on the run. In a place like Texas, lots of people could run off to Mexico because they don't want to be captured. Nobody knows what's going to happen to the former Confederate government leaders. Will they be tried for treason? Will they be hanged? I mean, there's just nobody knows. So people just they take off.
Sure.
And so really Texas is in a state of chaos, and the Union Army has to kind of come in and keep the peace. And they announce this General Order number 3. Now we do know that there were slaves in the Texas region who did know about abolition. They did know it. But as again, there were others that had not. But this is now it's official, right? It's this official statement.
Right.
It is abolishing all laws that were passed by the Confederacy. Texas is now really under Union military rule. It is an official proclamation. And I think what's important for the listeners to get at is just because you proclaim it doesn't mean people are going to do it.
That's a
And
good point.
right. And so in the same way, just because, in a couple of weeks, we will celebrate July 4th. And as from Philadelphia, that's always a big holiday in Philadelphia.
Mhm.
And in fact, just yesterday, I drove past the very building, well, the replica of the building, the original burned down, of where Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence.
Wow.
And so just because you declare it on July 4th does not mean King George is going to say, oh, well, yeah, sure, Tom, you've convinced me. Enjoy
Sure.
your
There's always going to be opposition and
yeah,
resistance.
exactly. And so just because you declare it, what's very important for people to realize is this. The 13th Amendment is the pivot piece here. The Emancipation Proclamation is an executive order. It is an executive order by a commander in chief in wartime powers. It is quite possible, in an alternate universe where after the war, slavery continues.
Hmm.
It is very possible that the Emancipation Proclamation is passed as an order by a wartime president. But if the war ends and slavery still exists, it's possible that a settlement could have happened. I mean, it's all of these things are possible. We are in
Dr.
uncharted
Draper, I'm
territory.
sorry not to cut you off. Can you
Yeah,
go back to that point? That was pretty unique. You said a settlement.
yeah. Yeah, one of the things we see is that when Robert E. Lee goes to Appomattox Courthouse to surrender to Ulysses S. Grant,
Mhm.
he offers to negotiate a peace. And Lee really didn't have that official power, and Grant did not have that power to make those decisions. But had that happened, had Grant and Lee had the power to negotiate a peace between the Confederacy and the United States,
Mhm.
it's possible in that arrangement that the Confederacy could exist, or it's possible that the negotiation would be that the slave states will come back into the Union, but they would be able to keep their slaves. Anything's possible because at this time, uh, Delaware and Kentucky, Union states, are still slave states. So it's
Sure.
possible that and again, you just don't know. And but the plantation owners and the Confederate leaders, they realize this. They think, okay, maybe this is negotiable.
Mhm.
What's really important for the listeners to understand is this: until the 13th Amendment is ratified by the states, by 3/4 of the states, it is not the law of the land.
Wow. So you mean
That's
it's
what puts it on the Constitution. Lincoln knew this. Anytime a president signs an executive order, even today, if President Joe Biden signs an executive order and in 2024 he loses reelection to whomever, that person can merely abolish the executive order.
Hmm.
They do not have staying power in that way. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes the predecessor, the person that follows them, doesn't. But they can. So the very fact that this was an executive order and not a constitutional amendment was very important. It was not until it was a constitutional amendment that now this is the law of the land.
So I'm pretty sure that the slave owners had to know this, correct?
Oh, yes. And that's why this period between June 19th
Hmm.
and December 6th is so pivotal to this story, because there's still a possibility at that point where the slave owners realize we might be able to get back into the Union and keep our slaves. Um, this will help a bit. One of the things is the value, and this is an awful thing to have to say in 2023, but the value in human souls was quite significant. People became very wealthy over selling slaves,
Sure.
owning slaves. They were a valuable commodity. Let's just put it what it was. And what shows you this is the fact that the plantation owners were willing to give up land to the Union Army, but not their slaves. We'll hide them in Texas. They are
Mhm.
such a valuable asset to their way of life and their and what they see as their economic viability.
Sure.
And
Profitable
so
injury.
it is very profitable. I mean, I have seen stories where slave traders at the time of the Civil War were making $150,000 in then. I mean, that's quite significant.
For that
Um,
time. Absolutely.
Precisely. And so it's a very so you can see that they really do see it's not just um, the racial component. We can get into that as well. But financially, they saw this as without my slaves, what am I? I can't go on.
Hmm.
I just can't make it. Which is actually a very we now historians would actually say that was a false idea. There was that slavery was actually hindering the process of farm technology, but this was what people understood and believed at the time. And the other piece is, I don't think people in the South in general, even the non-plantation owners, wanted to live in a society where they would now be equal to the people who had once been slaves.
Sure. Which is sad. So we know that African Americans still struggled for equality post slavery. What impact did the Black codes have? For example, Blacks were not allowed to vote, were
Yeah.
not allowed to hold office, we weren't allowed to serve on juries, couldn't even homestead or carry guns onto the plantation. Can you talk about a little bit about the Black codes and how that impacted society then post
Yeah.
slavery?
But I'm going to go back one step further, if it's okay. Is
Sure.
I think that the if you actually read the book Democracy in America by de Tocqueville,
Mm.
which is written in the 1830s. All right, so this is 30 years before the Civil War. He is a French aristocrat, diplomat. He is touring this new republic, and he writes this amazing book that even today is still worth the read on what he observes. And one of the things he observes is slavery. And he makes a statement in that book that America has put themselves in an extremely difficult position because they have based their slavery on race. And what
Mm.
he was saying was that they, unlike the, say, ancient powers where in Rome or Greece, where anybody could be a slave, it wasn't based on any sort of ethnic or color or anything like that. In America, it was race based, which means you have marked out a group of people for in perpetuity, according to Tocqueville. You've created a caste where in the Roman Empire, if
Mhm.
someone had been emancipated, you would never know they had been a slave. So he really called America out for creating a caste system that was going to be sort of a bone of contention for them for a long time. So there's a prophecy; it's almost prophetic. It's eerie how prophetic de Tocqueville was in observing that. So yeah, so now when you go to the period after Reconstruction and you're into the Jim Crow, you have the black codes, the black laws. Uh, yeah, what these do is they create laws that will essentially reinforce caste. They reinforce that, okay, you might be free, but you're a different type of free.
Sure.
There's almost an asterisk next to your freedom. What's really important for this, and I've presented on this, I've written on this, and I really think there's something to is what this does too is it not only does it um, oppress a specific group of people, it actually, once you codify these things, it tends to create a social imaginary for the people around it. So, because people look at a law and they say, oh, well, this must be something to do X must be bad because there's a law against it. And they won't actually question that. It's called sort of a social imagination. And so, what happens is if you have a set of laws that will take a group of people and say, okay, you can't have guns, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do that. It sort of reinforces in the culture, okay, well, there must be a good reason for that. There must be something about this group of people that they can't handle guns, they're this, they're that, you name it. And it's not until you take a deep dive where you start to say, hey, wait a minute, what's wrong with this? The imaginations can be shaped by these laws. And that's what's really scary. Frederick Douglass made a very interesting statement before the Civil War. He said racism is the product of a diseased imagination.
Hmm.
So it's not just the
That's
law.
powerful.
It's very powerful. And the laws are important because the laws, not only do they create a caste and they oppress a group of people, they tell everybody else in this imagination space, which is not this well thought out rational space. Oh, this is good. They're protecting us from these people, or they're protecting us from this, or they're protecting us from that.
Sure.
It really takes a change in imagination for people to start to question.
You know, that's an interesting point that you made. My mind jogs back to General Granger and when he actually read General Order 3. And correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a portion in that order where he encouraged the slaves to, now that you're free, to actually go and work quietly.
Yeah.
Do you think that may have been still a stigma against Black African Americans during that time, that they were not truly equal? Because here you have a general
Yeah,
from the Union Army encouraging the slaves, although you're free, you're still a little different.
that certainly comes across in the order. Um, if I want to play sort of General Granger's advocate and say, okay, Texas is an upheaval.
Mhm,
You're trying to get the state back in order in some way. One of the things you need to have in order for the Confederacy to be rebuilt is economic viability. And economic viability means agrarian, means crops, means planting, all of that type of stuff. How are we going to do that?
mhm.
And so there's that piece. But I really don't think, Jerron, that people knew what freedom was going to look like. I wrote my dissertation many moons ago on a Philadelphia pastor named Albert Barnes, who I mentioned in the blog. And early on, uh, Barnes was opposed to slavery, but he was not what we call an immediate abolitionist. Someone like William Lloyd Grant was, or I'm sorry, William Lloyd Garrison was a immediate abolitionist. He wanted
Okay,
to end slavery instantaneously. It needs to end. It should have ended yesterday.
sure.
Where I call Barnes someone sort of an immediate gradualist. And what he meant was he wanted to begin some form of gradual emancipation immediately. And his argument for this was how do you prepare the former slave for freedom? How do you prepare the nation for this reality of freedom?
Mhm.
And so he called for beginning a program of emancipation that went along with training. And essentially, you have to think through this process. You can't just say, okay, 4 million people, you're free. Now what? You have
There's
to
no
have
plan in
something,
place.
right? You have
Sure.
to, and of course, we start to see this, right? Groups like the Freedmen's Bureau and things like that will be formed. So there's really this sort of seat of the pants operation. What's also important for the listeners to realize is this: even up until the months before the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect in 1863, Lincoln was still trying to convince free Black people in the North to leave the Union. He was still trying to convince them to go somewhere. He would convince Congress to pay to send African Americans, in his words, to any warm climate they wanted to go to. So it wasn't even just Liberia anymore. Just you can't live with us. That was really Lincoln's thought.
Was
And
Congress opposed to what Lincoln was actually trying to do?
well, I mean, at this point, Congress is divided. You have the radical Republicans who no, they would not be okay with this. But then you
Mhm.
also have lots of Democrats who are sympathetic to the South. What's interesting with Lincoln is had Sherman not taken Atlanta in 1864, a lot of scholars wonder if Lincoln would have even won re-election. That's how tenuous things were in 1863.
Mhm.
So what that says to me is this: you really don't have a plan for what you're going to do with what they refer to as freemen, um, and they don't have a plan on what they're going to do. The winning the war is the key, and you have to win the war first. Now, what do you do with these people who are free? Well, it's open to debate. Um, and so I think this also creates part of the tension that African Americans feel in freedom and in this order. There's not a plan. And the bigger concern is getting Texas back on its feet, back moving along. And again, I think I show in the blog that there's multiple understandings of what this freedom means. So there are times when freemen will go to Union soldiers and say, hey, I'm free. What can I do? And they say, you can go wherever you want. You're free now. And then they go up to another Union soldier who might be a general's adjutant who's trying to get the economy back together. And so, well, you need to go back to your plantation and work there.
Mhm.
So in some ways, I think there was a simplistic thinking to say, well, now the slaves will just be laborers. They'll do the same thing. The black people will do the same thing. They'll just now get paid for it, and we'll all be okay. We'll all be happy.
Which was so not okay. And in fact, Dr. Draper, you wrote in your blog, and if you don't mind me quoting this, you said, quote, "Yet the story does not end there. Slavery did not die on June 19th, 1865. Many Africans were tormented for celebrating their freedom, and the
Yeah.
resentment harbored against them unleashed a torrent of violence. It is one thing to announce the end of slavery, it is another thing to enforce the order," end quote. That is pretty powerful. And I think it goes along the lines of what you're saying now, correct?
Yes, I mean this what is one of the saddest parts of this story is that once it's declared, the slaves have to fight for the right to celebrate their freedom.
Sure.
I mean, and again, this is different than say the American Revolution, right? Where you're declaring this as a foreign power, and now you have to go to war. The slaves are now being tormented by the people who, and again, what it is, it's this weird psychology. The Southerners realize, okay, they've been defeated in the war.
Mhm.
There's animosity to having to surrender. There's animosity towards the Union Army, but they're really impotent to do anything about that. Where
So,
can they have their outlet? Well, on you people, because you people are the reason this happened to us, right? That sort of thing.
sure.
And the fear of having a society where they are going to have to live as equals. That is just beyond the pale for really, in many ways, for most Americans, North and South, even in 1865, to
Mhm.
think that Africans and whites are going to live as equals in this country is just, as I said, Lincoln couldn't have seen it in 1863.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I love what you're saying. It almost sounds like in the Confederate South that the precedent was understood that Black folks are chattel property. They are to be slaves. They are to work without pay, and we can treat them any type of way that we want to. So, that being the subculture, it had to be extremely difficult for our ancestors to overcome that. And I can absolutely understand what you're saying. It makes perfect sense. So, I want to transition a bit. You also wrote, in other instances, plantation owners were willing to pay freemen, but still wanted the same amount of control
Right. Right.
over their new employees.
Yeah.
You also said, as they had when they were slaves, including the right to beat them. Can you maybe describe for my listeners who may not be familiar with some of the civil penalties that was imposed upon African American slaves should they decide to escape from the plantation? Can you maybe paint
Yeah.
a picture of that?
Yeah. I mean, everyone we hear about whippings,
Right.
and that was a common practice, as was branding, as was deformity. If you had a slave who ran away too many times, you might cut off part of their foot.
Hmm.
You might deform them in some way. There's always this sort of tension of how much you deform the slave, because you want them to be able to produce for you, right? So there's that part. Um, there were instances of males being castrated, all types of things like this, women being
Terrible.
raped. Um, now all of a sudden, sometimes castration was a last resort because you were also wanting these male slaves to reproduce slaves. But if this would be something they would resort to if need be. All manner of what is really just heinous behavior in this idea of making a slave conform. What's really important to remember is there were people who said, okay, we lost the war. We can't enslave them the same way. And now we have to pay them. Okay, fine. We can live with that.
Mhm.
But what we can't live with is these people, and I'm using that term, running wild in the society. They're the type of people that have to be controlled.
Mhm.
And you would hear this sort of language, right? So therefore, whatever the labor arrangement was, you have to have it in such a way that they're controlled. So again, this goes back to this view of these people, the view of Africans as secondary, as a second class citizen, as somehow not able to handle themselves the way white people can. So that even if you're going to be forced to pay them, you need to have a system in such a way where you're still able to control them.
Correct.
Otherwise, you're just going to have a chaotic system where they're just running wild. There's this, like, it's almost based on Greek philosophy. They're just going to live into their lusts and they're just going to run wild. And of course, then there's the obsession, absolute obsession of interracial mixing. And what will that bring about? I mean, how many lynchings were done in the South over the alleged
Mhm.
rape of a white woman, or not
Yeah.
even the rape, just a black man looking at a white
Looking
woman,
at a white woman,
right?
sure.
So that idea, there's a sick obsession with it. They were just absolutely obsessed with it. And I think maybe one way to get this too, Javon, is maybe one way to look at this story and look at the history of the civil rights movement is that you if you think of what was the big piece, you think of the case in Virginia over interracial marriage. You kept seeing these ideas that were just part of the social imagination of Southern culture
Mhm.
in the antebellum era, and it really took decades to impose laws to get rid of living them out. And the last one maybe being interracial marriage, which was this obsession. So every one of these objections to absolute equality for Africans, really, if you think about it and go back and look at how Africans were viewed in the antebellum period, you're one step after another. First it's voting rights, then it's okay, you can vote. All right, we can't stop you from voting, but we're not going to let you marry anyone you want to marry. So you can almost see this
Which was a
progression.
continuation of the Black
Mhm,
Codes.
exactly, right. It's
Sure.
it's almost like a what they call a defense and retreat, right? You're going to keep fighting for these ideas And when you lose one, well, okay, now we got to fight for this one. When you lose that one, then you got to fight for this one. And then you kind of roll the tape back and kind of create, okay, what was a composite view, a Southern view of an African American in, say, 1850? Well, here's the list. And then you can almost watch history as a fight to impose legislation to challenge those things. Because, like I said, you have to use laws in this way. I mean, you're a criminal justice person, so you understand this even better than I do. There are times when you just have to pass laws because they are right. I am not going to change your imagination that way. Hopefully, the laws over time will change how people view a certain activity or something like that.
Well, it's funny that you said that, Dr. Draper. That's actually a very interesting point. Yes. So in criminal justice, one of the arguments is if there's no law, then it possibly cannot be a violation, right? I think it's just a
Right, right.
logical flow of things. So what you're saying is absolutely correct. As a follower of Christ, right? We're brothers in the Lord. We have
Yeah.
placed our faith in Jesus Christ. We are washed in his blood. How does this make you feel on a more personal level, knowing that this happened in American history? Do you feel like our nation has evolved since then?
Well, so there's always two questions there. As a Christian, I'm appalled. I'm nauseated. I'm saddened. Um, what I think troubles me the most out of this is that you have Christians doing this to Christians. I think that's a really
Mm,
important part, that many of these African American people were in themselves Christians and being treated in this way. Um, and I do believe this as a church historian. When I look at the story of the Black church in America, I see a miracle. I don't know what other word to use because of the way Christianity was used for so long as a tool to support oppression.
sure.
And the very fact that African Americans took to this religion, they shaped this religion. They, in some cases, developed a resistance hermeneutic to the way some scriptures were being used. It's a remarkable story.
Mm.
But it's a very sad story and repulsive story as to how all of this transpired.
When you say resistible hermeneutic, could you
Yeah,
maybe
yeah,
talk
sure,
more
sure.
about that?
I mean, it was sort of common parlance for a lot of people
Mm.
at that time to read the story of Noah and believe that the curse of Ham refers to Africans.
Africans.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that was just a common
I've
hermeneutic at the
heard that
time.
quite often in
Yeah,
theological
yeah.
circles.
Even, what's interesting, even in this story of Juneteenth, when the Union troops settled into Galveston, I saw a quote from one Union soldier explaining about how many slaves there just were still left in Texas, and said, I couldn't believe how many Hamites I was seeing. I
Mm,
mean, that was an act. He wrote this in a letter to a friend of his up north. So even at that point, they're still using that language. So there's that piece. Even the way Paul's interpreted on slavery, things like this. So there's a resistance hermeneutic, and it gets developed.
mhm.
But with have we evolved as a nation? I think in some ways, yes. In some ways, yes, we have. Have we? Are we all the way there? No.
Do you think the
Absolutely.
1967 Reconstruction Act helped African Americans, the plight
In
of us in this country?
1867, in 18 yeah, Reconstruction was a significant advance for African Americans. In fact, even in the blog, what I say is that I think they at that point they go from being they're not just Africans, they're African Americans. They're actually seen as
Mm,
Americans at this
sure.
point. This is sort of a like wow kind of moment. Uh, Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, resigned his Senate seat as a representative from the state of Mississippi to secede from the Union. Uh, During Reconstruction, an African American won that seat. I mean, this. I can't pick a better picture of just how much Reconstruction changed things when a African American is now sitting in the Senate seat
Wow.
that was
Th-
held by what was would become the former president of the Confederacy. That is a big deal. But it also shows you this: the fear that Southerners had of their world being turned upside down by absolute equality of Africans was real, because
Absolutely.
Black people in places like Mississippi had, with the power of the box, had the ability to make changes. And so it was a real thing, right? It was very effective. And you have a lot of African Americans being elected to very prominent roles in the former Confederacy during Reconstruction.
Sure. And that's what I tell a lot of people now. Look, in order to affect change, you have to vote. If you're going to complain, go vote. There's no other way around it. Our
Yeah.
ancestors has died and fought for these civil rights.
Yep.
So if you're complaining, you're unhappy with the system, please go vote.
It was, even today, Jovan, what you will hear sometimes today, they'll say, well, so and so was elected governor of such and such a state. This is the first Black governor since Reconstruction. You will hear things like that even today,
Hmm.
when African Americans make strides in getting elected into positions. They'll say, well, this isn't the first time, but it's the first time since Reconstruction, things like that.
Sure.
So you'll still hear that today.
Dr. Draper, I had a few more questions for you before we actually close our
Sure.
episode. Going back to 2021, President Biden signed Juneteenth as a national holiday, which was already being celebrated in the state of Texas long before that
Yeah.
even was signed. So, why did it take so long, in your view, for it to become a federal holiday?
Yeah, it's fascinating you bring that up. I was actually spending some time this weekend, and I was talking to some people who grew up in Texas,
Huh.
particularly during the civil rights movement. So those were some interesting conversations. And in their understanding, it was a holiday that was mostly African Americans would celebrate, even in the 1960s.
Mm.
White people weren't involved with it, unless maybe they were invited to a picnic or something like that. That is how they described it.
Which many people know Juneteenth for big
Yeah.
celebrations,
Yep.
picnics. It's very
Like the 4th of
festive.
July,
Sure.
that's how it's yes, exactly. Why did it take so long? There's a really interesting book by an author named Eric Fauner, where he refers to the Civil War and Reconstruction as really the second founding.
Hmm.
I tell my students all the time, the way I have it wrapped up in my head is that the scripture of the United States is the Declaration of Independence. The commentary is the Constitution. It's one thing to say we hold these truths self-evident, blah, 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 blah. The next question is, how are you going to do it?
Sure.
That's where the Constitution comes in. Um, and I think it takes so long for America to get to this point because of, in some cases, the racial element. What de Tocqueville was getting at is the fact that this imagination of who this group of people are,
Mhm.
and the negative ideas that were cast upon a group of people. I think there's something to that. I think de Tocqueville was right. We set our course in some way by creating a situation, and so that there's part of that. The other piece I think it takes so long is I think too. I think in 2008 there were people who really believed we finally got over it. I think when
Mm.
President Obama was elected, there were people saying things like, "Oh, America's finally post-racial. We finally did it. We're finally there." And obviously, we're not. Um, and I think this can happen. I'll go back to the blog article. When
Sure.
Juneteenth happens, William Lloyd Garrison writes this just glowing piece about, well, finally we can celebrate July 4th without being hypocrites.
Hmm.
And in light of the story, in light of what we know, obviously Garrison couldn't have imagined. In light of what we know, that seems a bit Pollyannish. He just couldn't imagine what was going to transpire. He thought we finally got there. We finally did it. And here we are in 2023 saying, well, no, now we have a second holiday to really get at this celebration. So I think people sometimes they're overly optimistic. They think, oh, we finally got there, right? William Lloyd Garrison, we're finally got there. President Obama, 2008, we finally got there. And then you
Mhm.
realize we haven't. And it's freedom and equality is a work in progress, always.
Well, Dr. Draper, I appreciate you summarizing those points for me for my listeners. I want to transition to my last and final question for you. You know, the Apostle Paul mentions how the believer in Christ is no longer a slave to sin. Can you maybe extrapolate any spiritual correlations between Juneteenth and us being under the slavery to Satan? Is there any spiritual connections in that piece?
Yeah, I mean, the one of the things is June 19th is a civil holiday, right? We're talking about civil equalities. And so that we want to be careful with that. It's not a religious holiday like
Mhm.
Christmas or Easter or something like that. So it's about a civil equality. But yes, I mean the language of slavery and sin. I'll go back to the First Great Awakening, Javon. What
Okay.
what actually began with one of the language that people like George Whitfield are using. Historian Mark Knoll points this out very well. Is this very almost political language? He talks about you're bound to sin. You lack liberty, you lack your freedom. He uses this language, but the oppressor is not King George. It is not plantation slavery. It's sin. And
Mhm.
so and some scholars have argued that that actually started to help Americans think about their political situation.
Sure.
But when you look at the Apostle Paul talking about being bound to sin, I think the people who got that the best was someone like a Frederick Douglass. I think a Frederick Douglass saw that the slave system was damaging not just the slave, but also the white person,
Mm.
right? It was because what it was doing was it was allowing that diseased imagination to fester,
Yeah.
right? It was so if your brother in Christ you're African American and your brother in Christ owns African slaves, you should probably be praying for your white brother as well as your African Americans. And some people might say, how could you be a slave owner that way and still be a Christian? That's a whole other set of questions.
Well, I
But
couldn't ever understand that because even
yeah,
Jesus said, "Do unto others," right?
yes,
So
right, right,
obviously,
right.
making someone your chattel property is not treating others as you would. It's not loving your neighbor, and
Yes,
that's quite
yes,
sad.
yes, and one of the things I think that's really important is the anti-slavery biblical argument
Mhm.
would have argued that yes, there was slavery in the ancient world. Yes, there were probably times where Christians owned slaves. We know there were Christians who owned slaves. We have that in the New Testament from the book of Philemon. But that Paul created such a message that it would undermine the ability for a Christian to be able to do this. So Paul didn't come out and say everybody free all your slaves. He didn't say that. That would have been political suicide. But what he
Mhm.
did is he created a system. He created a language that if you are consistently practicing it, you will be convicted to the point where you just can't do this. I mean, to the point where there are even some legends out there. Church, we don't know this for fact, but in the book of Philemon, Onesimus, the story of the slave. There's even idea that in that story, the slave. There's a legend that the slave was freed and eventually became a bishop
Mhm.
of the church, right? So there's this storyline,
Sure.
um, and again, Christians will have this very complicated relationship with slavery almost for its entire existence up
Mhm.
until the 19th century. Um, they so it's not as if what happens in the new world is new in the fact that they have slaves. What's new is that it's race based. Um, so that becomes an important aspect of this. So for Christians, this has always been a difficult issue. Um, but I think you're right. How do you treat somebody that way? And then how do you treat somebody who is actually a Christian that way? Because even in the
Mhm.
Middle Ages, it would have been wrong to enslave a fellow Christian. You could enslave a non-Christian, a pagan, a heathen,
Sure.
but you were not supposed to enslave a fellow Christian. So this is why in some cases we see where plantation owners don't want their slaves converting to Christianity
Yeah.
for that. So yeah,
Well, we realize the freedom that Christ brings the believer. And I am always amazed when I look back on my past life. I thank the Lord that He has broken the shackles and I am no longer a slave. I also can appreciate Juneteenth, even my ancestors who went through a horrible,
yeah,
horrible life.
yeah.
The very fact that I can sit here today and talk to you and do this podcast, this is what America is about, right? We are a constantly evolving nation. We're not a perfect nation. We have a soured history, but thank God for His sovereignty and His grace over our nation. So, Dr. Draper, this concludes our special episode. Thank you so much
Thanks for
for
having me.
enlightening us today on the historical significance of Juneteenth. May God bless you. You are a dear brother in Christ. I appreciate you. Um, thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Thank you.
And with that, we are going to rock out.